What is going on, everybody? James Hancock here, back to review the first 3 episodes of Raised by Wolves, which made their debut today on HBO Max, and I'm relieved to say that there's finally something that I want to watch on HBO Max. I've been subscribing for months, and while I won't make the claim that Raised by Wolves is a perfect show, that said, I'm really enjoying it. I'm on the verge of falling in love with it. It just remains to be seen how strong and consistent it'll remain over the next 7 episodes. For people who don't know, this is a sci-fi show created by Aaron Guzikowski, who wrote the first 3 episodes as well as the last 3 episodes. But what attracted my attention initially is the fact that the great Ridley Scott directed the first 2 episodes. And if you're a Ridley Scott fan, at a bare minimum, you got to watch those first 2 episodes and see if the show gets its hooks into you. And then as a way of passing the baton to the next generation within the Ridley Scott family, because there are a lot of directors in this family, including Tony Scott, who sadly pushed on a few years ago, but Luke Scott, Ridley's son, directed episode 3. And I'm going to abstain from mentioning any spoilers initially because I just want to make the case to the unconverted as to why they should give the show a chance. But as I get into the end of my review, there are a few scenes and details that I won't be able to resist talking about. But you know how there's some shows out there where people will say, oh, well, you got to watch the first 5 or 6 episodes before you can get into it. Or sometimes people even say, oh, you got to see the first 2 or 3 seasons, then a show finally gets good. I refuse to accept that as justification for watching any show. And luckily with Raised by Wolves, it hits the ground running because not only is the first episode good, it ends in such horrific, devastating fashion that I was honestly kind of floored and disturbed by what I just witnessed. But in broad strokes, this story takes place well in the future when you've got 2 rival factions that have essentially rendered the Earth uninhabitable and are now seeking to create human colonies far, far away. And you have these 2 camps. You have the atheists and you have the Mithraics. And with the atheists, they're basically trying to create colonies of humans who 100% completely embrace science and avoid religion and superstition of any kind. And with the Mithraics, they're incredibly technologically advanced. However, they do worship a god that they call Sol, and they've got an incredibly intense belief system bordering on like a caste system in terms of having a hierarchical society of rank, but they don't avoid technology, far from it. They have these giant arcs that are floating through space, oftentimes with 1,000 people on board for setting up their colonies, and they use androids to perform a lot of important services. But what's really interesting about this show is that it's not entirely clear who the audience should be rooting for, because both sides have their more interesting qualities and they also have massive blind spots. And because both sides have such a strict ideology or such a strict system of beliefs, you're not even allowed to digest or consider or even be exposed to ideas or information or stories that fall outside their rigid dogma. And if what I'm describing is starting to sound like some people you know in real life or online, that's all the more reason to be watching this show. But the dramatic hook of this show, or the heart of this show, is all about these 2 androids, mother and father, who are trying to raise a human colony on a planet that they believe to be totally uninhabited that would be ideal for building a new society of scientists. And actress Amanda Collin and actor Abubakar Salim, if I'm saying his name correctly, they absolutely make the show. They are so good as androids. It might be heresy to say this, but they're going to start giving Lance Henriksen and Ian Holm a run for their money for the incredible androids that they played in Alien and Aliens. But these 2 androids have been tasked with this mission of raising human beings from infancy without any religion of any kind. And they have all sorts of challenges and obstacles to overcome, from horrible weather to a shortage of food and water. But making things even more complicated is that you have a colony of Mithraics who have arrived in their giant ark, who are looking to do basically the same thing, but with a different system of values on the same plot of land. And so naturally, a conflict ensues, and caught in the middle of all this are all these poor innocent kids who are just trying to survive and make it until the next morning on any given day. And as is always the case with any violent struggle, both sides feel completely, totally justified in all their actions. They both have that moral certitude that can get really dangerous. But where the show starts to become eerie and unsettling is when we start to realize the full power and capabilities of the character Mother, played by Amanda Collin. This is not a spoiler because it's featured prominently in the trailer, but she's the type of android called a necromancer. In the context of the show, there's all kinds of androids with varying degrees of power. But a necromancer android essentially has the power to commit complete and total genocide against the opposite faction. And when the character Mother really unleashes her full capabilities, it's just mesmerizing. She basically turns into this naked golden goddess, where just through the sound of her voice and the power of her gaze, she can do the most unimaginably horrific things to any living creature. And I love it when horror and sci-fi get interwoven in such a fashion. Even during the opening credits, it feels incredibly eerie. We have all these haunting images from the war between the Mithraics and the atheists. I just love the vibe all around. And my favorite bits of the show so far during the first 3 episodes are during the flashbacks to the war back on Earth. But even more important, this show features scenes and images that I've never before seen in sci-fi. I'll get to that in my spoiler section, but this is legit, down and dirty, gritty sci-fi. And I don't want to say it's thinking person sci-fi because that somehow seems to imply that there's a lack of thrills or excitement to the show. This show is overflowing with all sorts of violent altercations that are fascinating to behold. But what I love is how the show doesn't feel derivative at all. Because we live in an era where anytime someone makes a science fiction movie, you can say, oh, well, that person obviously really likes Metropolis, or that person really likes 2001, or that person really likes Star Wars, or that person really likes Blade Runner. Raised by Wolves feels like a genuinely original concept, and while at times the writing might feel a little clunky because writer Aaron Guzikowski, he has to communicate a lot of information about this world, so there's a lot of expository dialogue that doesn't quite feel natural or roll off the tongue, because obviously he's trying to create dramatic scenes between the characters, but he's also trying to flesh out this world. And I would say on the whole, he's successful, but there'll be times where you'll think to yourself, oh, okay, that was obviously an information dump. But no matter what you might think of the dialogue and the characters, one thing that cannot be denied is that the show just looks stunning. It looks as good as any sci-fi feature film you care to mention. And 3 episodes deep, I just feel like this show is turning into this astonishing cautionary tale about fanaticism, where it's so abundantly clear these massive glaring blind spots that people develop when they never question their assumptions or never question whatever cause they might be a part of. And the struggle in this world is starting to become much more complex because, as it turns out, there's more to this world that's going to threaten the lives of the characters than just the simple ideological struggle between these two camps. So sign me up. I'm 100% on board. New episodes will be coming every Thursday morning just after midnight. I'm not quite sure if I'll be doing breakdowns and reviews for each and every single episode, but I'll definitely be back at the end of the season to give my overall thoughts. But that's as far as I can go without discussing spoilers, so if you don't want any details, bail out now. But there are 1 or 2 scenes that I want to call attention to before I wrap up this video. So let's start with mother and father. As I mentioned before, they're the heart of the show, and I love just how awkward and strange and inhuman their interactions are. I love how father's always trying to tell jokes. Mother doesn't like jokes. She's always telling him it's not the time. And I love how, in spite of the fact that they both have been programmed by the same creator, their interests and their goals and their strategies are not always in complete and total alignment with each other. As we see when mother starts to get overloaded and overstimulated, which happens frequently throughout the first 3 episodes. And anytime she gets overloaded or overstimulated, people start to die, including father, who she straight up murders when she realizes that he's working against her. But what really sold me on the show were all the flashbacks to the war on Earth, where you see several necromancers floating through the sky. They just look so unholy and so evil and so menacing, and just hearing them shriek and just watching them lay waste to people. And we start to realize the full extent of the power of mother at the end of the first episode, when she just flat out massacres and destroys an entire ark full of 1,000 people. She sneaks her way on board, starts taking people out one at a time. She decides to save a few of the children as a way of starting over her colony. But there's one little moment that really got to me, because as disturbing as it is when she does something like turn people inside out and make it look like their entire head's just turning into giant tumors, she did this one bit where she needed somebody's retinal scan. So she tells this guy to hold still or she's going to hurt him really badly, and rips off his eyelid and uses his retinal scan to take over the ship. It was just absolutely ruthless. And I just couldn't believe the lengths that this character would go to achieve her goals and objectives. But she's not completely totally evil, because she does have this strange yearning to be a good mother. So while she's terrifying and she's obviously the main antagonist of the season, she does have these instincts that make your heart go out to her. And just the way she uses her body language, her awkward, frequently hysterical way of speaking, she's just an absolutely fascinating character and a great addition to the world of sci-fi. And I'm a big fan of the characters Marcus and Sue as well. One of my favorite scenes by far is when they figure out that the only way they're going to survive this war on the planet Earth is by masquerading as Mithraics. And in one of the eeriest scenes by far of all seasons, when they find this android who's half melted, and they carry him away like a friend, but they realize he's still operating at 70% capacity of his skills, and they have him perform plastic surgery on the 2 of them to make him look like 2 of the Mithraics that are booked to leave Earth on one of these arcs. They realize that's one of the only ways they're going to survive. But just the image of this half-melted android hacking into and rearranging the faces of these 2 characters, I just realized we were in new terrain in the world of sci-fi, and as a fan of the genre, that was very thrilling. And another aspect I'm really enjoying is the fact that this planet has all these otherworldly forms of life that they barely understand or are barely familiar with. There are these giant skeletons of enormous reptiles that obviously imply that at least at some point, enormous life forms walk the surface of this planet. But we also have these horrible monsters that I presume are living somewhere deep in the bowels of this planet. And in one of the most exciting scenes all season, they emerge and attack the camp, trying to go after one of the teenagers who happens to be pregnant. And we see Mother just go berserk, blowing them up one after another. At times, I find the Mithraics to be a little clunky and awkward, but I think that's on purpose because they have such a rigid code of conduct and such a rigid hierarchy. And they're so obsessed with their faith that when they meet strangers, that's the first question they ask. What is your faith? And it just hammers home the dangers of fierce tribalism. And in an era for us right now where tribalism seems to be at an all-time high, I just love the fact that we have a show that really hammers home just how dangerous it is to only talk to and interact with people who share your views and check off the exact same bullet points in terms of what you stand for. But if I were to call attention to one real flaw of the show, some of the child acting is a little uneven, which is obviously always the case anytime you're dealing with a cast with kids. But I just feel like some of these kids can act, like Wynton McGrath, who plays Campion, who appears to be the real protagonist of the show and the only character so far who doesn't seem to have some serious, massive ethical shortcoming, and his on-again, off-again relationship with his father and the way their trust kind of comes in ebbs and flows. That's probably the most moving part of the show for me. But some of the other child actors on the show, I'm like, oof, maybe y'all should consider giving those kids a few fewer lines. But moving forward, obviously, I'm hoping that the show will be able to maintain the quality that we've seen so far. There are going to be different writers and directors for the next couple episodes, so there's a very real possibility that it might dip in a big way. So even with the show that I like, I always try to maintain a critical eye. What I'd like to learn more about are the atheists. We've seen precious little so far, apart from some flashbacks to Marcus's childhood, where we see how these kids are raised to be warriors at a very young age with these backpacks on them that basically give them a jolt and make them superhuman, but also incredibly unstable. And there are just so many little horrific details involving body modification that I just find absolutely fascinating. And I'm really curious to learn what is the purpose of these deep wells or pits in the surface of the planet that appear to be bottomless, but I have a feeling there's some massive life forms that are deep, deep, deep down there. They're going to force these two warring factions to finally get along. Or who knows, maybe Mother's just going to go berserk and end up killing all of them. In any event, if you're a sci-fi fan, I definitely recommend that people hunt this stuff down because there's so few original ideas in the world of sci-fi. More often than not, people just dust off something old and try and make it live again. And I applaud any writers and filmmakers who are trying to create brand new intellectual property, dealing with some really complex, weighty themes. It's a show that doesn't preach. It doesn't beat the audience over the head with a hammer. And I love watching ideological wars on screen from which you can infer certain conclusions, but you're not required to buy into whatever the ideology of the filmmakers or storytellers might be. And in today's highly partisan times, that's a very rare, wonderful, beautiful thing. In any event, that's all I have to say about this show for now. I'll definitely be following it from this point forward. And I'll be curious to hear what my fellow sci-fi fans think as well. So give me a shout down in the comments below or give me a shout on Twitter at Colbrax. But please remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, hit that notification bell. I'd really appreciate it. But thanks as always for watching my video. I really appreciate it. But more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.